The winter air inside my mother's house was always freezing, but on Christmas Eve, the temperature felt downright subhuman. I stood in the doorway of the guest room, clutching a worn-out, mismatched blanket, watching my 60-year-old mother, Eleanor, toss a thin, threadbare yoga mat onto the hardwood floor. The wood groaned under the slight impact, a hollow sound that seemed to echo the emptiness of the massive mansion she called home. The house itself was a monument to her vanity: gilded mirrors, imported Italian marble, and crystal chandeliers that cast cold, fractured light across the high ceilings. Yet, for all its opulence, there wasn't a single shred of warmth to be found within these walls. "He can sleep there," Eleanor said, her voice smooth and entirely devoid of emotion. She didn't even look back at me as she smoothed out her own pristine, Egyptian cotton sheets on the king-sized guest bed. Every movement she made was calculated, a deliberate display of her absolute authority. "The guest bed is imported satin, Clara. I'm not having a boisterous 6-year-old ruining the thread count or spilling something. Besides, a little discipline builds character. Children these days are entirely too soft, and I won't have your lack of parenting ruin my property." My chest tightened, a sharp, suffocating pain that made it hard to breathe. My son Leo stood just behind the hem of my coat, his small fingers digging so tightly into my jeans that his knuckles turned white. He didn't say a single word. He didn't cry or whine. He just stared at the hard, cold floor, holding his favorite broken toy car tightly against his chest. The red paint on the toy was chipped, and one of the wheels was held together by tape, a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding him. Leo was an incredibly quiet child, especially since my husband, David, passed away 18 months ago in a tragic accident that turned our world upside down. Since losing his father, Leo had retreated into a shell of silence. He didn't throw tantrums, he didn't demand luxury, he just wanted to feel safe. But it was Christmas, a time when a child should feel nothing but love and magic. "Mom, it's freezing in here," I whispered, keeping my voice as steady as possible because I refused to let Leo see the panic and fury rising in me. "The radiator in this wing isn't even turned on. I can sleep on the floor. Let Leo have the bed. Or if that's too much to ask, at least let him sleep with me in the tiny twin bed in the old maid's quarters down the hall. We can squeeze in together." Eleanor turned around slowly, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her eyes were cold, sharp, and calculated, devoid of any grandmotherly affection. To her, Leo wasn't a grandchild. He was an inconvenience, a reminder of a daughter who chose a modest life instead of pursuing the high society status Eleanor valued above all else. "This is my house, Clara," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, dictatorial whisper. "Let's not forget the reality of your situation. You came to me begging for a place to spend the holidays because your miserable little apartment had a major heating failure. If you don't like my rules, the front door works perfectly fine. You are welcome to take your son and sleep in your freezing car. Otherwise, Leo sleeps on the floor, or he can sleep out in the unheated garage. Choose right now, because I have better things to do than argue with an ungrateful daughter." I looked down at Leo. The contrast between my mother's glittering diamond rings and my son's pale, trembling face was agonizing. He looked up at me, his large eyes wide and watery, reflecting the dim light of the hallway. He saw the tension in my shoulders, the tight line of my jaw, and the tears I was desperately fighting back. Instead of crying, he gave me a tiny, brave nod, squeezing his broken toy car closer to his chest. "It's okay, Mommy," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the whistling of the winter wind outside the window. "It's like camping. We love camping, remember?" That sentence broke something fundamental inside me. It didn't just break my heart, it shattered the final remnants of my patience and guilt. For 3 long years, ever since my father passed away from a sudden illness and left Eleanor as the sole executor of the family estate and the family-owned logistics company, Vanguard Logistics, she had treated me like a pathetic charity case. My father had built that company from the ground up, starting with a single delivery truck, with the explicit intention that it would support our entire family for generations. He had always promised that I would have a seat at the table. But following his death, Eleanor had ruthlessly exploited a series of legal loopholes, cornered the controlling shares, and effectively locked me out of any real leadership role. She forced me into a low-paying administrative position in the filing department, paying me just enough to survive while she lived like royalty in a sprawling mansion, treating my son like a second-class citizen, simply because my late husband didn't come from a wealthy, old money lineage. I didn't argue further. I knew that arguing with Alina was a useless exercise in vanity. Instead, a profound, icy calm washed over me. The tears stopped. The desperation vanished, replaced by a razor-sharp clarity. I knelt down on the cold hardwood floor, kissed Leo gently on his forehead, and helped him settle onto that freezing, thin yoga mat. I took off my own heavy wool sweater, wrapping it as tightly as I could around his small shoulders, and layered the mismatched blankets over him. As Alina walked out of the room, clicking her heels sharply against the floor like a victorious soldier, she turned off the main light, leaving us in the shadows. 3 days, I whispered to myself, staring at the closed door as the darkness swallowed the room. Just give me 3 days. The next morning was Christmas Day, but there was absolutely no warmth or holiday spirit inside that house. The morning began not with the laughter of a child opening presents, but with the cold, methodical routine of Alina's social schedule. When we walked down into the grand living room, a massive 12-foot pine tree stood decorated in uniform silver and blue glass ornaments. Professionally styled, of course, because Alina believed children's handmade ornaments were tacky. Beneath the tree sat dozens of perfectly wrapped boxes, but almost all of them were addressed to Alina from various high-profile business associates and socialites. Alina sat on her velvet sofa, sipping espresso, barely glancing up as we entered. With a careless wave of her hand, she pointed to a single, small bag hidden behind the tree trunk. "That's for the boy," she said indifferently, already returning her gaze to her tablet. Leo walked over quietly, his eyes holding a faint glimmer of childhood hope. He carefully opened the bag to find a single pair of plain, white, oversized tube socks purchased from a discount clearance store. They were far too large for a 6-year-old. Leo didn't complain. He looked at the socks, looked at Alina, and said in his polite, quiet voice, "Thank you, Grandma." Alina didn't even acknowledge his gratitude. Instead, she picked up her phone to answer a call from one of her high society friends, immediately bragging loudly about the designer Italian leather handbags and diamond tennis bracelets she had treated herself to this year. She talked at length about her upcoming winter trip to Aspen, complaining about how difficult it was to find good catering for her elite holiday brunch later that afternoon. To her, Leo was completely invisible, an unsightly piece of scenery that didn't fit into her picture-perfect, wealthy aesthetic. But while Alina was busy preening, adjusting her expensive jewelry, and preparing to host her wealthy circle of friends, I retreated to a quiet corner of the den with my laptop. Alina assumed I was merely doing the mundane, low-level data entry that she routinely dumped on me over weekends and holidays to prove her dominance. She thought I was mindlessly processing invoices and shipping manifests. She had no idea that I was actually deep within the encrypted architecture of the master financial ledger of Vanguard Logistics. For the past year, I had noticed subtle, recurring discrepancies in the quarterly financial reports. Alina had been growing increasingly reckless, driven by an insatiable need to fund her lavish lifestyle and maintain the illusion of immense wealth to her peers. She believed she was a criminal mastermind because she utilized a highly complex, multi-layered digital routing system to siphon corporate funds into a dummy offshore account based in the Cayman Islands. To cover her tracks, she ruthlessly cut employee healthcare benefits, frozen wages for the hardworking truck drivers, and deliberately delayed payments to long-term vendors, nearly destroying the reputation my father had spent decades building. What Alina completely forgot, in her profound arrogance, was that my father had trained me in forensic accounting before he passed away. He knew I had an analytical mind, and more importantly, he knew his wife's volatile nature. Years ago, before his health failed, he had handed me a physical flash drive containing a master administrative decryption key to Vanguard's legacy servers. I vividly remembered the look in his eyes when he told me, "Clara, keep this safe, and keep it private. Use it only if your mother completely loses her mind and threatens the future of everything we built." As Leo sat quietly on the rug near my feet, completely content to play with his old, chipped toy car in absolute silence, my fingers flew across the keyboard. The festive music from Alina's party guests began to echo from the front parlor, the clinking of champagne glasses, the fake laughter of elites, the smell of expensive catering. I ignored all of it. I was a ghost in the system, navigating through layers of falsified shell corporations, tracking the digital breadcrumbs Alina had left behind. By 4:00 p.m. on Christmas Day, as the sun began to set over the snow-covered estate, I had successfully compiled an airtight, undeniable digital dossier. I had mapped out every single fraudulent transaction, every falsified corporate tax document, and every illegal wire transfer Alina had personally authorized over the last 36 months. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering. She hadn't just dipped into the profits. She had gutted the company's core operational reserves to purchase her luxury cars, her designer wardrobe, and the very mansion we were sitting in. I sat back in the chair, the glow of the screen illuminating the dark den. My initial instinct, fueled by pure rage, was to call the authorities immediately. I wanted to see flashing blue lights in the driveway. I wanted to see her escorted out of her mansion in handcuffs on Christmas Day. But as I looked over at Leo, who had curled up on the rug and fallen asleep from the sheer cold of the room, I forced myself to calm down. Calling the police immediately would be too messy. A public, high-profile criminal trial would trigger a massive media circus. It would cause Vanguard's stock to plummet, panic the institutional investors, and likely force the company into liquidation. That would completely destroy the financial legacy my father had intended to leave for Leo. No, a public spectacle would ruin everyone. I needed a much more precise, surgical ending, an ending that would strip Alina of her power completely while leaving the company intact. On the morning of December 26th, while Alina was away at a luxury day spa recovering from the immense stress of hosting her holiday brunch, I went to work executing my plan. Utilizing my administrative corporate access, I bypassed Alina's personal assistant entirely. I drafted an official, mandatory notice for an emergency, closed-door meeting of the board of directors and the primary institutional investors. I scheduled it for the morning of December 28th. I officially categorized the meeting agenda under a standard, mundane title: Urgent Restructuring and Quarterly Compliance Audit. Because I used the automated corporate governance system, the notification was sent directly to Alina's secondary, archived executive email, an account she rarely checked, as she left all scheduling to her staff. Blinded by her own absolute confidence and vanity, she didn't notice a thing. She spent the next 2 days shopping, completely unaware that the ground beneath her feet was turning to dust. 3 days after Christmas Day, the morning of December 28th finally arrived. The winter weather had turned brutal, with heavy snow slanting against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the grand corporate boardroom at the Vanguard Logistics headquarters. The room was the epitome of corporate power, featuring a massive, polished mahogany table surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension. 7 of the company's largest stakeholders and board members sat around the table, whispering among themselves, looking thoroughly confused and impatient. They had all received the high-priority, mandatory summons, and none of them knew why they had been called in during the holiday lull. At the head of the table sat Alina. She looked immaculate, wearing a tailored, cream-colored designer suit, her hair perfectly styled, and her fingers dripping with diamonds that caught the sharp fluorescent lighting. She was leaning back in her chair, exuding an air of supreme boredom and irritation. She hadn't expected me to be in the room at all, let alone standing directly at the head of the table next to the digital projector screen. "Clara," Alina sneered, her voice dripping with condensation and loud enough for the entire room to hear. She let out a soft, mocking chuckle. "What is the meaning of this absolute charade? Did you seriously call an emergency meeting of the board during the holidays for a filing dispute? If this is some pathetic, dramatic attempt to beg for a raise or air out your personal grievances, you are embarrassing yourself. Sit down, shut up, and get back to the basement filing room where you belong." I didn't blink. I didn't flinch at her words. I stood completely still, looking directly past her to fix my gaze on the chairman of the board, Mr. Arthur Aris. Mr. Aris was a stern, highly respected man in his late 60s, a lifelong friend of my late father, and someone who possessed an unyielding sense of corporate integrity. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," I said, my voice clear, steady, and projecting perfectly across the silent room. We are here today because Vanguard Logistics is facing an immediate, existential threat of total bankruptcy, corporate collapse, and federal prosecution. And unfortunately, the absolute source of that threat is sitting right there at the head of this table. I raised my hand and pointed a finger directly at Aliner. The boardroom erupted into a flurry of quiet gasps and murmurs. Aliner scoffed loudly, bursting into a booming, arrogant laugh that echoed off the glass walls. Are you completely insane, Clara? Have you lost your mind from grief or jealousy? I am the CEO of this company. I am the one who has guided Vanguard to record-high luxury asset acquisitions this past year alone. My leadership has kept this family name in the papers. You mean personal luxury asset acquisitions? I corrected her, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm tone. With a single, firm click of my remote control, the massive projector screen behind me lit up. The first slide wasn't a standard, manicured financial presentation or a colorful pie chart. It was a stark, black-and-white spreadsheet, a side-by-side comparison of Vanguard's employee pension fund deficits and the exact wire transfer receipts to a luxury yacht broker based in Monaco. Every single transfer was flagged, dated, and signed electronically via Aliner's private, restricted digital security signature. The mocking laughter died instantly in Aliner's throat. The smug grin vanished from her lips, and her face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ghostly shade of pale. What is this fake nonsense? She stammered, her voice suddenly losing its steady authority. She stood up so fast that her heavy leather executive chair scraped violently against the polished floor, making a harsh, screeching sound. This is a cheap fabrication. A desperate, disgruntled employee trying to frame me because she couldn't cut it in the corporate world. Arthur, don't look at that garbage, it's completely doctored. It's not a fabrication, Mom, I said, stepping forward so that I was looking her dead in the eye. Every single document, every routing number, and every offshore account transaction on that screen has been verified through the bank's digital blockchain ledger. Over the last 36 months, you have illegally siphoned exactly $4.2 million out of this company's core operational reserves. You bypassed the board's oversight by routing the money through 3 separate shell companies registered entirely under your maiden name, thinking no one would ever look into the legacy archives. The board members began muttering furiously, their initial confusion turning into cold anger. Mr. Aris put on his reading glasses, his face turning a deep, furious shade of crimson as he rapidly flipped through the physical audit printouts I had placed in front of him before the meeting started. Aliner, Mr. Aris said, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and deep disgust. He looked up from the papers, his eyes locking onto her. Is this true? The compliance numbers and profit margins you personally handed to the audit committee last month. They were completely forged. You stole from the driver's pension funds. No, Arthur, listen to me. Clara is a liar. She's vindictive. She's always hated my success. She's doing this because you made my 6-year-old son sleep on a freezing hardwood floor on a thin yoga mat on Christmas Eve. I interrupted, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper that cut through her frantic screaming like a knife. The entire boardroom went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. The seasoned business executives looked from me to Aliner, confusion and dawning horror on their faces. Aliner stared at me, her mouth opening and closing repeatedly like a fish pulled out of water. She realized, in that exact moment of silence, that this meeting wasn't just a routine corporate compliance audit. This was an execution. She had brought a knife to a corporate war, completely forgetting that I held the keys to the kingdom. I didn't call the federal authorities, Aliner, I continued, my voice steady as I walked slowly down the length of the mahogany table, stopping just feet away from her. I didn't call them because my father loved this company entirely too much to see his name dragged through the mud in a federal investigation. But here is what I did do. Exactly 1 hour ago, acting in my legal capacity using the private proxy shares left directly to me by my father shares that you thought you had legally suppressed, but completely failed to account for in the company's secondary corporate bylaws. I finalized a binding voting block with Mr. Aris and the majority stakeholders. I picked up a heavy, official document from the table, bound in black leather, and slid it smoothly across the polished wood until it tapped sharply against her manicured, diamond-clad fingers. What is this?" she whispered, her hands trembling so violently that she could barely touch the paper. "It's your immediate termination, effective right now," I said, each word sounding like a gavel striking a sounding block. "By a unanimous vote of the board, you are stripped of your title as Chief Executive Officer. Your executive access codes have already been permanently deleted from the mainframe. Your company-leased luxury vehicle has already been flagged for immediate repossession, and your corporate credit lines have been completely shut down as of 5 minutes ago." Elinor gripped the edge of the mahogany table, looking around the room frantically, searching for a single ally among the faces of the people she had known for decades. "Arthur, you can't let her do this to me. I built the modern aesthetic of this brand. I own the estate. I own the family house." Mr. Aris looked up from the financial documents, his eyes filled with absolute disdain. He closed the folder with a heavy thud. "If Clara doesn't hand these files over to the IRS and the SEC by the end of the day, Elinor, you should consider it a true Christmas miracle. Sign the resignation document, pack your immediate personal belongings in a single box, and leave this building before I have building security physically drag you out of here in handcuffs in front of the entire staff." Realizing she had absolutely no cards left to play, and that her wealth, her status, and her protection had completely vanished, Elinor's arrogant posture collapsed entirely. She sank back into her chair, looking older than her 60 years. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her hands shook so violently she could barely grip the pen I extended toward her. With a trembling hand, she scribbled her signature on the dotted line, her eyes filling with hot tears of pure, unadulterated rage and total humiliation. As she stood up to walk out of the boardroom, completely ruined and stripped of her power, she stopped at the door, glaring back at me with pure venom. "You destroyed my entire life over a stupid floor, over a child's bed." I looked her dead in the eye, feeling the immense warmth of total, unyielding victory for both myself and my son. "You thought you could freeze us out, Mom. You thought you could treat my son like garbage because he didn't fit into your wealthy world. But you forgot a very basic rule. You forgot who built the actual foundation you were standing on. This company doesn't belong to your vanity anymore. It belongs to Leo's future. Have a nice life." Elinor turned around and stumbled blindly out into the hallway. Her expensive designer heels no longer clicked with the sharp pride of a dictator. Instead, they echoed with the hollow, tragic sound of total defeat. 3 days after she told my 6-year-old son to sleep on a freezing floor on Christmas Eve, I quietly ended her reign, her wealth, and her power. And as I walked out of the corporate headquarters, stepping into the crisp winter air to go pick up Leo from his daycare, I looked up at the sky and smiled. I knew that from this day forward, my son and I would never, ever be cold again.